Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Friday, May 23rd, 2025, and you're listening to Alex's News. It's shaping up to be a warm one in Riverside, with the high forecast to hit 86.8 degrees today, dropping to a pleasant 61.0 degrees overnight. Perfect weather to get out and about. Later in the program, we will be taking a closer look at what the future holds for the significant piece of legislation known as the One Big Beautiful Bill, now that it is under consideration in the Senate. And we will investigate the reasons and context behind California's legal challenge regarding the blocking of its electric vehicle regulations. All this and more coming up on Alex's News. Stay tuned. We're starting this morning with a monumental piece of legislation that just cleared a major hurdle, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. A name that certainly catches the ear, narrowly passed the House of Representatives yesterday. It's a package aiming to combine sweeping tax cuts with significant spending reductions and policy changes, very much in line with former President Donald J. Trump's agenda. Here to help us unpack this massive bill is our news reporter, Ethan. Ethan, this bill sounds like it had a bit of a dramatic passage.
That's putting it mildly, Grace. According to the New York Times and NBC News, it passed by an incredibly slim margin, in one instance by just a single vote. It also faced unanimous opposition from Democrats. Supporters are framing it as a key piece of legislation to enact President Trump's America First agenda, focusing on prosperity, opportunity, and security, as described by Perplexity API sources.
Quite the nail-biter, then. A big part of this, I understand, is a hefty dose of tax cuts. It sounds like a real tax-apalooza. What can you tell us about those?
It certainly is a significant tax package. The absolute centerpiece, as reported by PBS NewsHour, NBC News, the New York Times, and Perplexity API, is making the 2017 Trump individual and business tax cuts permanent. Those were due to expire at the end of this year, and proponents are claiming this move will prevent what they say is an average 22% tax increase for taxpayers.
22% is a substantial figure. What other tax relief measures are bundled into this One Big Beautiful Bill?
Well, PBS NewsHour, NBC News, and the New York Times also highlight a very notable change: the elimination of federal income taxes on tips and overtime pay. Perplexity API sources project this could translate to up to $1,750 in added benefits for overtime workers and $1,700 for those who receive tips.
That will surely be a welcome change for many in the service industry and those clocking extra hours. Is there anything in there for homeowners or families specifically?
Yes, there's a new temporary deduction that would allow individuals to deduct interest on car loans, but specifically for domestically made vehicles, according to PBS NewsHour and the New York Times. For families, the bill temporarily increases the standard deduction by an additional $1,000 and adds a $500 bonus to the child tax credit. However, these particular provisions are set to expire after 2028, as noted by the same sources. Perplexity API also mentions the aim is to lock in and expand the doubled child tax credit for over 40 million families.
And what about the state and local tax deduction, the SALT cap? That's always a contentious point.
It is indeed. PBS NewsHour and NBC News report that the SALT deduction cap would be raised to $40,000 for individuals who earn less than $500,000 per year.
I also heard whispers about something called Trump accounts. It sounds a bit like a presidential piggy bank for kids.
You could say that, Grace. PBS NewsHour, NBC News, and the New York Times detail these new tax-preferred savings accounts for children. The idea is they would be seeded with a $1,000 federal contribution for children born between January 1, 2025 and January 1, 2029. These funds would then be invested in the stock market, and parents would be allowed to make additional contributions.
That's an interesting concept. Are there any other tax provisions we should be aware of?
Yes, Perplexity API sources indicate the bill also expands 529 education savings accounts supports childcare and paid leave tax credits, expands health savings accounts, or HSAs, and makes business tax deductions permanent. And, as PBS NewsHour points out, it also eliminates the federal tax on gun silencers.
Now, with all these tax cuts, there must be some significant spending reductions to try and balance things out, or at least attempt to. Where are those cuts primarily focused?
That's the other side of the coin, Grace. PBS NewsHour and NBC News report major cuts to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, commonly known as SNAP. We're talking about a reduction of $267 billion over a 10-year period, which also involves shifting more costs to the states and expanding work requirements for recipients.
And Medicaid? That's a massive federal and state program. What's the impact there?
Medicaid is facing nearly $700 billion in reductions, according to PBS NewsHour. The bill introduces what it terms community engagement requirements, A, which means work, education, or community service, for able-bodied adults. It also mandates more frequent eligibility verification. The New York Times and Perplexity API note that these work requirements could be accelerated, potentially being implemented by the end of 2026.
What's the projected human impact of those Medicaid changes? Losing coverage is a serious concern.
It is. The Congressional Budget Office, or CBO, estimates that these changes could lead to 8.6 million people losing their healthcare coverage, as reported by PBS NewsHour. Other analyses, cited by Perplexity API, suggest that number could be as high as 14 million people losing coverage due to these requirements and any associated Affordable Care Act premium hikes. NBC News also adds that the bill cuts Medicaid funding to states that allow undocumented immigrants to access Medicaid. And PBS NewsHour notes, provisions to defund Planned Parenthood are also included in this package.
The bill also addresses border security, which was a cornerstone of the former president's platform. What's being proposed on that front?
A substantial amount of funding and resources. PBS NewsHour reports that $46.5 billion is allocated for border wall construction and increased immigration enforcement. The New York Times reports a figure around $175 billion in new spending for immigration enforcement. NBC News describes this as a, quote, a cash infusion intended to significantly beef up border security and facilitate mass deportation plans.
Are there any specific measures outlined for individuals seeking asylum?
Yes. PBS NewsHour mentions that a $1,000 fee would be imposed on migrants who are seeking asylum. The stated goals tied to these broader immigration measures include removing 1 million immigrants annually and housing 100,000 individuals in detention centers.
It truly sounds like an omnibus bill, touching nearly every facet of domestic policy. What about defense spending and energy policy?
NBC News reports a significant one-time boost in military spending. PBS NewsHour adds that part of these funds are allocated for a missile defense shield. On the energy front, it's a different story. NBC News says the bill terminates several $100 billion in clean energy tax breaks and credits. Specifically, the New York Times reports it repeals clean energy tax credits that were part of the Inflation Reduction Act.
So this represents a considerable rollback of previous green initiatives and investments?
Precisely. Perplexity API details that the bill sharply narrows existing clean energy and manufacturing credits. It imposes a very stringent 60-day construction start deadline for new renewable power projects to qualify for any remaining credits, and it requires project completion by 2028, though there are some exceptions for nuclear plants. It also, as PBS NewsHour notes, increases drilling and mining activities on public lands.
And student loans? That's always a major topic of concern for millions of Americans.
PBS NewsHour reports that the student loan program would be significantly overhauled. It would replace all existing repayment plans with just 2 options, and would also repeal Biden-era regulations that had made it easier for borrowers to have their loans canceled. Additionally, PBS NewsHour mentions there's a tax on university endowments included in the bill.
With all these tax cuts and new spending initiatives, what's the overall impact on the federal deficit? It sounds like it could be a quote-quote deficit nightly large number.
You could certainly say that, Grace. The Congressional Budget Office projects that this House-passed bill would add approximately $4 trillion to the federal deficit over the next 10 years. This figure is consistently reported by NBC News, the New York Times, and Perplexity API. The CBO also issued a warning, according to Perplexity API, about possible sequestration-level cuts in Medicare that could be triggered due to this substantial increase in debt.
$4 trillion is a staggering figure. Yet, the bill does have its supporters, doesn't it?
It does. Perplexity API notes that it has garnered support from organizations such as the American Farm Bureau Federation and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. They praise what they see as its pro-growth tax code. Proponents of the bill claim it will prevent an average tax hike of $1,700 for families and, on top of that, provide an additional $1,300 tax cut on average, while also increasing wages.
So this massive and clearly controversial bill now heads over to the Senate. Is it expected to have an easy journey there?
Not in the slightest. Both NBC News and the New York Times report that it is expected to undergo significant changes in the upper chamber. Perplexity API sources indicate that Senate Republicans, including Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, are planning what's being called a substantial rewrite rather than just passing the House bill as it is.
A substantial rewrite? That sounds like a lot of work. When are they expected to begin tackling that? And isn't there a debt ceiling deadline looming that adds pressure?
You're absolutely right on both counts, Grace. Work on the Senate version of the bill is expected to kick off after the Memorial Day recess, which means in the week of June 2nd. That's just about 10 days from today. And yes, the clock is ticking. Treasury Department projections, as cited by Perplexity API, indicate that the U.S. will hit its debt ceiling by mid-August 2025. So they have roughly 2.5 months to sort this out.
What are some of the key areas where the Senate might diverge from the House version of the bill?
Perplexity API suggests several major points of contention. The deep cuts to Medicaid and the strict work requirements are highly unpopular in many circles, so the Senate may look to soften those provisions to mitigate potential coverage losses. The SALT cap is another area. While the House bill raises it to $40,000 for certain incomes, Senate Republicans are expected to propose a much higher SALT deduction cap, which is a politically sensitive issue for members from high-tax states.
And what about those rollbacks of clean energy credits we discussed earlier?
The Senate is anticipated to take a significantly different approach to the House's rollback of clean energy credits. This could mean moderating the repeals or adjusting the phase-out timelines to address concerns about the impact on the energy sector and various regional economies. And quite interestingly, Grace, early estimates from Perplexity API suggest that a Senate version of this bill could actually add even more times to the deficit than the House version, potentially around $5 trillion.
$5 trillion? That might not go over well with some of the more fiscally conservative members within their own party.
Precisely. Perplexity API notes that there are already concerns from senators like Rand Paul, who is reportedly a definitive no on the House version as it stands, and Ron Johnson, who is considered a likely no. Given the narrow Republican majority in the Senate, which is 53 to 47, their opposition, along with potentially others, could be absolutely pivotal in determining the bill's fate.
It's an incredibly complex and contentious piece of legislation, that's for sure. It sounds like the Senate has a monumental task ahead of it, and we'll be watching every development very closely. Ethan, thank you so much for untangling that one big, beautiful bill for us this morning. It's certainly a lot for everyone to digest. And that's just the first major story we're tracking this morning. For our second story this morning, we're shifting gears to a major environmental and political showdown. The U.S. Senate has made a move that's causing quite a jolt in California and beyond. We have our news reporter Chloe here to break it all down for us. Chloe, what exactly happened in the Senate?
Grace, it's a significant development. On Thursday, May 22nd, the Senate voted to block California's ambitious electric car mandate. According to reporting from NPR, the vote was quite close, 51 to 44. This mandate, as you know, was set to require 100% of new passenger cars and trucks sold in California to be zero emission by 2035, which is a little over 9.5 years from now.
100% zero emission, that's a huge target. Was it just the car mandate, or did this Senate vote affect other regulations too?
It was broader than just the passenger vehicle rule. The Santa Barbara Independent, citing calmatters.org, reports that the Senate's action also blocked California's Advanced Clean Trucks rule and another regulation aimed at reducing nitrogen oxides from trucks. So it's a triple hit to California's clean air efforts.
How exactly can the Senate just overturn state-level environmental rules like this? It sounds like a real power struggle.
It is, and the mechanism they used is something called the Congressional Review Act, or CRA. Essentially, the Biden administration's Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, had granted California federal waivers back in 2024. These waivers are part of the Clean Air Act and have historically allowed California to set its own, often stricter air pollution standards due to its unique smog problems. The Senate used the CRA to revoke these specific waivers.
So California had permission, and now the Senate is trying to take it back. I can't imagine state officials are too happy. What's the reaction from California?
You could say they're pretty charged up, Grace. The Santa Barbara Independent and Perplexity API are reporting that California Governor Gavin Newsom and Attorney General Rob Bonta have already announced their intention to sue the federal government. Governor Newsom didn't mince words. NPR noted he called the Senate's action a, quote, middle finger, end quote, to California's autonomy, and even suggested it threatens American economic dominance in the EV market, potentially giving China an edge.
Strong words indeed. What's the core of California's legal argument going to be? Fighting the CRA sounds complex.
It is. California's main argument, as detailed by Perplexity API and NPR, is that these EPA waivers granted under the Clean Air Act are not technically, quote, rules, end quote, as defined by the Congressional Review Act. Therefore, they contend the CRA cannot legitimately be used to revoke them. Interestingly, NPR also reports that this view is apparently supported by guidance from the Government Accountability Office and even the Senate parliamentarian, whose advice against using the CRA this way was reportedly disregarded by the Senate majority.
Disregarding the Senate parliamentarian, that's a notable step. So what's the justification from the senators who voted to block these California rules?
Well, Republicans who led this effort, like Senator John Thune, mentioned by NPR, accused Democrats of supporting an, quote, electric vehicle mandate, end quote. Proponents of overturning the waivers, including some in the oil and agriculture industries, argued that California's rules harm economic and national security interests. The Santa Barbara Independent also pointed out that some, including a few Democrats, raised concerns that the mandate is costly and unduly limits consumer choice.
So it's a mix of economic arguments and concerns about mandates. What about the other side of that coin? What are environmental groups and EV supporters saying?
They're definitely sounding the alarm. Both the Santa Barbara Independent and NPR highlight that environmental groups and EV proponents have heavily criticized the vote. They're warning of negative impacts on air quality, public health, and the broader efforts to combat climate change. This is seen as a significant blow, especially since, as the Santa Barbara Independent notes, 11 other states and Washington, D.C. have already adopted versions of California's electric car mandate. It really could stall their progress.
This 2035 target for all new cars to be electric always sounded incredibly ambitious. Were there questions about its feasibility even before this Senate action?
Yes, there were. Perplexity API compiled information showing that independent analyses and industry projections, even before this month, had raised questions. These concerns included whether California's electricity grid could handle the massive increase in demand without substantial and costly upgrades. There were also worries about constraints in the supply chain for critical minerals needed for batteries, like lithium and cobalt. Plus, analyses suggested the pace of charging infrastructure development was lagging, and there were concerns about the higher upfront costs of EVs disproportionately affecting low and middle-income consumers.
So even without this Senate vote, California had some significant hurdles to clear. What's the Biden administration's likely stance now that its own EPA's waivers are being challenged?
While specific official statements weren't detailed as of this morning, Perplexity API indicates the Biden administration is expected to support California's legal challenge. Their prior actions in granting the waivers and the strong opposition from Senate Democrats suggest they'll align with California in opposing the Senate's decision. They're likely preparing to defend those waivers and California's authority. It seems this issue is far from running out of gas.
It certainly sounds like this story has many more miles to go. A complex situation with major implications for environmental policy and states' rights. Chloe, thank you for breaking down this electrifying news for us.
You're welcome, Grace.
Here are some other headlines. In Louisiana, detained Palestinian activist Mahmoud Khalil was allowed to hold his newborn son for the first time on May 22nd after a federal judge intervened. Khalil, a legal permanent resident and Columbia graduate student, has been held in ICE custody since early March as part of a crackdown on pro-Palestinian protesters, though he faces no criminal charges. ICE sought his deportation, citing his activism. After his son's birth in April, Khalil was repeatedly denied contact visits by ICE and private prison contractor Geo Group. His wife, Dr. Noor Abdallah, had even traveled over 1,400 miles with their baby hoping for a visit. Following legal battles, a New Jersey judge overturned ICEA's no-contact rule, a move hailed by civil rights groups who criticized the agency's actions as cruel. Meanwhile, the indigenous Marubo tribe from the Brazilian Amazon is suing the New York Times, TMZ, and Yahoo for at least $180 million each. The tribe alleges a June 2024 Times story defamed them by suggesting their youth became addicted to pornography after gaining internet access via Starlink. The lawsuit claims the media outlets sensationalized the report, smearing the tribe and causing significant harm to their community and cultural projects. In tragic news from San Diego, groundbreaking music executive Dave Shapiro died in a private plane crash on the morning of May 22nd. Shapiro, 42, was a licensed pilot and owner of the plane. 2 employees of his agency also perished. Shapiro co-founded Sound Talent Group, representing artists like Pierce the Veil and Sum 41, and was a staunch advocate for independent musicians, co-founding the National Independent Talent Organization. Across the nation, Black Lives Matter street murals continue to serve as enduring reminders of the 2020 protests against racism. Originating in Washington, D.C. on June 5, 2020, the original installation on 16th Street Northwest, unveiled on Breonna Taylor's birthday, became a global symbol. While some murals, like the D.C. one which began removal in March 2025 for construction, are temporary, they remain powerful declarations for justice and memorials, even as they face erasure or controversy. And finally, the Trump administration announced on Thursday, May 22nd, that Harvard University will be ineligible to issue international student visas. This decision, stemming from accusations that Harvard failed to protect Jewish students, could decimate several of the university's 42 varsity sports teams, as approximately 21% of its athletes are international. Teams like men's heavyweight crew, hockey, and squash heavily rely on these students. Harvard views the move as punitive, warning it could undermine its athletic competitiveness. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King with Claude Sonnet 3.7, Gemini Pro 2.5 Experimental, Gemini Flash 2.0, Perplexity Sonar Pro, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.